All right, so this week we're talking about Roy Rappaport, and we're going to be talking about his idea of ritual and religion and the relationship between religion and the evolution of the human species. This was his last book, right, that he wrote?
Yeah, I think it was his last or like one of the last things he wrote for sure. I put this on my reading list because I was looking to like theories of language and um, most of the theories of language they deal with evolution, like how language came out of evolution. Most of it's like naturalistic, so like humans are imitating sounds they hear in nature, or like it has some kind of like function. It repeats like the sounds they make when they do labor, something like that. But Roy Rappaport's theory is a little more philosophical to me. So it becomes a little more interesting because his theory is like, I'm not so concerned about like what specific like biological or natural um what's the word like stimulus caused this to evolve. I'm more concerned about like what are the what's like the more abstract reason that religion would one be useful to humans and two be important to humans, right? Not just useful but important itself. And so the reason why his theory is interesting is because he says language and religion had to come into existence for humanity around the same time because the requirements of both um are almost entail the truth of the other, right? Like you cannot have religion without some theory of or sorry, some form of language. You cannot have language that works without some kind of religion establishing its truth.
I think I can understand why you need language for religion, because like religion is at the very minimum is a set of beliefs, and those beliefs are correlate to concepts, and you need some sort of language to have concepts. I can't think of a I can't think of a non-linguistic concept or non-conceptual language. But why do you say that we need religion in order for the language to be given meaning?
Yeah, so we can go more in depth as we look through his ideas in this
Okay.
talk. But I think to put it like most succinctly, um, it's an idea in anthropology. You could almost call it a principle, especially in the theory of language, that lies are cheap. That's the kind of wording of it. So what that means is that in order for you to, you're going about in the world, saying a lie does not cost you almost anything. You can be deceitful and there's not much consequences, but there's a lot of benefit for you, right? It's almost like the free rider idea. The idea that like you can take all the benefits of society without contributing to society at all. It's like a similar concept as that, but within language. So what he's trying to understand is like if the fact that lies are cheap is true, and so there's no incentive to tell the truth in a species that is developing language, then why would language ever arise if there's nothing to distinguish truth from lies? And you see that in apes, right? When apes start learning language, they are really quick to deceive each other. He goes into an example of that in the book, but there's a lot of anthropology and science that has shown that too, especially with chimps that have learned like sign language. So what his main argument is that you need this religion, and specifically you need ritual in order to give the language some kind of authority. And that's where the concept of truth starts coming out.
So first there's sort of the base set of like concepts and beliefs, and then the rituals we perform in conjunction with those beliefs are what give the beliefs their truth.
Yeah, they're almost coextensive though. Like the the language and the ritual are co-evolving.
Oh, okay.
I mean, one might be a little prior to the other, but mostly they're like a thing that has arisen at the same time. And also, like, I mean, he means language proper because, like, obviously, like primates have proto language and they can even do things like lie and they can symbolize things to some degree, but he wouldn't call that language, right? So there might be a proto language before there's ritual, but he's not talking.
Mhm.
There's not like a language proper, like a series of symbols, a system of symbols. One of the interesting things about this, though, is we've been talking about, um, these Hegesias and Schopenhauer, and we've already talking about these like fully developed ideologies, and there's already things like truth taken for granted within these systems, right? There's like a search for the truth. There's already an idea of like what constitutes the good. And I want to bring this in because as we're looking at these different religion and philosophers, it's good to start from ground zero sometimes and think, well, how do these ideas of good even be established? Why is pleasure the good? What makes aestheticism good? What kind of social institutions bring those things out and create this worldview in which these ideas are asserted? And I think this is a good framework for investigating that.
Like it says on the first page, it says religion is central to the continuing evolution of life. I
Mhm.
mean, how literal of a sense of the word evolution are we talking about?
Yeah, so he's talking about the evolution of humanity. So he distinguishes biological evolution from the evolution of humanity, which means like um once humans evolve language, there's a different kind of evolution going on, like one that is specifically the adaptation of humanities within their own field, their own like world that they've created or constructed.
Does it have something to do with like this idea that like you can only kind of work with what you've got available at the time? Like like you only really see UFO religions come about when only after the concept of a UFO is like something that is even a thing. Is that sort of what we're talking about? Like the evolution of materials from which religions can be derived?
So language kind of has two functions. It can tell you, it can describe things, right? But the other thing that it does is it creates new worlds and new potentials. So your UFO example, I think part of what how he would analyze that is that the language allowed this concept of UFO to even come into play, and this idea that there's something unidentified versus identified, right? And so,
Right.
but then you need, in order for there to be that kind of mystery, that kind of experience, you need to have some kind of norm, something that is normal, a system of beliefs that are considered normal in order to have that opposition, right? And he talks about it later. He calls that the alternative. There's two different ways that language kind of breaks down, but it's not entirely bad because it provides language ways for language to evolve as well, right? There's the alternative and then there's the lie. So the lie is a deliberate falsehood within the realms of the language that you're talking. And then the alternative is given this concept of the universe, what other potential orderings could there be? So I feel like the UFO deals more with that within his conception.
There's more of like an aspect of contingency with that.
Yeah, I mean, it's all contingent, right? Because he's saying that basically every society has its own world based on the symbols that it works upon.
Yeah, but like not everyone looks at every symbol as having religious significance. I think that's one of the things that's been interesting to me, especially recently, where you see people taking things like, like I talked to the funnists. So they take fun and imbue that as like some sort of religious ideal to strive towards. You have the Davison people that take a computer program that like up until then there was really only one person who imbued it with religious meaning, and that was Terry, the guy that created the system. Nobody else was looking at it and thinking, yeah, this is something we should be building a religion around. That's kind of the question that always like burns a hole in my brain, is like trying to figure out like, why does person A, why do persons B through Z look at some object and then person A looks at it and is like, this has religious significance, or I'm going to imbue this with religious significance. You know what I mean?
So I think the portion that we read, I don't know if he gets into that too much. And I also wonder, he's very careful to say ritual is the thing he's mainly talking about. And I wonder if there's a reason for that, because I don't know if we have to be talking about religions proper to even be using his analysis necessarily. Like we talked about anti-realists on here, for example. Well, they have their own set of symbols and their own beliefs and a worldview that becomes normalized through authority of its own,
Mm.
right? And so there's things that they believe are true and false, which are kind of counterintuitive to how me and you might think of true and false, but it makes sense within the confines of their system. So I wonder if that's more what he's talking about. And the reason that he's focusing on religion specifically is because by and large, that's the most ubiquitous form this has taken in human society.
I feel like I've been caught up in the anti-realist stuff so much over the last couple weeks that I don't even know what's true or false anymore. Is that the authority of is that the rit is that some sort of ritual that I've been participating in without realizing it, and now it's kind of infected my brain?
Yeah, I mean, but they have their own. Okay, so I don't know if I want to go down this rabbit hole, but when we talk to them, they say, well, you can still have values. They're just your values. They're your desires, right? So it's like they do have an answer to the same questions. They're just kind of retreating into the individual, right?
And is this an example of the lie that you're talking about with Rappaport?
No, I mean, so he distinguishes lie from deception. Deception and lie almost has to be willful, right? But I don't think when these religions are emerging or these philosophical systems are emerging, they're willful, like um willful falsifications. They're
No, yeah, I don't think so either. I think they're like people, um, I think they're people who are having some sort of experience. And I mean, at least the approach I take is like, as far as I'm concerned, when someone reports like a spiritual experience or religious experience or whatever, an otherworldly experience, they're reporting the facts as they understand them. Whether they're right or wrong, that's a separate question. But I tend to approach the study of religion as like, this person is reporting what happened in the way that they understand it, you know. Although you've pointed out to me, I think recently, that maybe what I'm describing is not an exhaustive picture of how all religions come into being. Like maybe some religions get formed out of these, like, kind of otherworldly experiences confined to like one person. Like Joseph Smith has some wild experience, and now we have Mormonism. But you've kind of pointed out that like maybe that's not how every religion gets formed. Like maybe there's a little bit more of like a political underpinning to the emergence of other religions.
Yeah, we could analyze that. Maybe we push that towards the end and we can maybe
Sure.
take the framework that we have so far and then kind of analyze the examples you gave earlier and then like the Mormons and see if maybe we can figure them into the framework.
Okay.
So I want to talk about some of his basic premises and then I want to see how you feel about them.
Yes.
All right. So one of his first ones he gives is that humanity lives in a world devoid of intrinsic meaning, right? Like humanity comes into this world with no meaning at all, but the only meaning that we do have is the meaning that we've constructed, right? Like there's no meaning that's handed down to us out of nowhere. I mean, maybe some religions would believe that, but I think there's almost too many religions for us to take that as a serious truth outside of those specific cultures.
Well, I guess when we say no meanings are handed down to us, like, what about someone that's born in, I don't know, they're born today. They're born in a world where we already have like quite a good handful of well-established organized religions that are more than happy to hand hand down some meaning to them. You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
So he's saying that there's no intrinsic meaning. Like you're not going to find nature giving you a book, or like the sky is not going to pour down meaning from you. We're not going to discover meaning by diving into the ocean or something.
Okay, so what crazy hypothesis. Let's say that because I want to understand, I think what I'm trying to understand is what he means by meaning. Um, let's say the burning bush experience that Moses had was real.
Mm-hmm.
Would Rappaport still say that that's not that's not intrinsic meaning, or um, is the only reason he's saying there's no intrinsic meaning because at the end of the day he doesn't believe that burning bushes talk to people and convey the will of the divine to people?
Yeah, I think it's the latter because he calls
Okay.
religions false fictions, right? Or falsifications. They're just not deliberate ones. It doesn't seem like he is believing that any of these constitute an ultimate truth of reality.
Do you think he's sympathetic at all to the idea that maybe they each have their own little slice of some ultimate truth?
I haven't seen him talk in any terms like that yet.
Okay.
I'm guessing based on what I've read that it doesn't seem like he believes there's an ultimate truth outside of what we construct. Or if there is, it's so inaccessible to us that we're just not going to find it.
Well, I guess that's what I'm maybe that's an alternative way of expressing it. Like maybe it's not that each religion has a little slice of the truth, and maybe if we glue them all together, we'll get the full picture. Um, could it be that like there is some inaccessible truth that every time we form a new religion, we're sort of grasping about in the dark, trying to give form to something that is formless or to express something that's otherwise inexpressible? Like this is the best we can do, sort of thing.
Yeah, I actually like that. So Shakespeare in Midsummer Night's Dream, he says the poet gives form to airy nothing. And I think that's similar to what you're talking about. There's like
Okay.
it's kind of like just a formless nothing that has all the components to like meaning to be there, but it's up to us to create it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I like the distinction that I don't know who it might be John Vervaeke for all I know. But I like the distinction that I've seen some people draw between creating meaning and finding meaning. Like I like distinguishing between those two ways of talking about meaning, whereas like finding meaning seems to imply that there is this intrinsic meaning and we just have to find it. Whereas when we
Mhm.
talk about, yeah, you get where I'm going with that.
Yeah. So he quotes Vico at the end to support this. And I think, like I was telling you, like Vico says some things such as like truth and um truth and creation are the same thing, right? And so he's implying that like if we interpret Vico right, then we're going to assume that all truth is created. It's a fiction of human reality. And I don't know if Vico's saying exactly that. And I don't know if we have to take it to that extreme. Because I do think that he has this idea. He calls it two different things. He calls it the ideal state and he calls it divine providence. So he does have some belief in a like ultimate reality that's kind of beyond our comprehension. He's just saying that we don't have any direct access to it. So I just want to be careful because I do think that does make a difference. Because I do think these philosophies do want to ground themselves in some kind of ultimate truth. It's just that our way of accessing it is going to be limited by what kind of beings we are.
I think that's probably what I believe. I mean, just like I don't know. I mean, just I don't know that I even have a robust argument for why I hold that belief. I'm just guessing that that's probably what I believe based on the things that I do and the things I'm interested in and the way that I look at religions. I think that's sort of that belief is sort of the engine that propels me forward deeper and deeper into the cult world.
Oh, he calls it the ideal eternal history. I forgot the exact term. So yeah, I like that idea, and I think Rappaport doesn't lean on it, and then I don't know if he's not going all the way because he's writing a piece of anthropology and science, so maybe he doesn't want to get too much into the Platonism parts of Vico. But
Right.
I do think that's kind of a misconception people have about Vico is that he thinks literally everything is socially constructed and there's no truth beyond us.
You don't think that he's a constructivist?
No.
Okay.
I think he's very close. He's just, I don't think he would go all the way.
Yeah, I mean, to me, that's not inconsistent at all, because like there could be something beyond what we're capable of accessing, and yet like we're just, I don't know, we build with the materials that we have available. You know what I
But
mean? Like we whether we're talking about building a building, like there's certain natural resources that certain parts of the world have access to and others don't, and like there's or we're building a religion or a philosophy, there's certain ideas and concepts and methodologies that are going to be present in one area or another. I mean, maybe that's not as true today because we're all connected now, but like when these religions were being formed, that certainly was true.
yeah. And so I think another thing that Rappaport might say, though, now that I just thought of it, is that maybe in the fact that I'm saying that maybe there's an ultimate reality, right? That Vico's relying on one, even though he wants to get away from it, is proof of his point. Like it's hard to even conceptualize doing things like truth or morality or even things like time and eternity without some kind of like ultimate reality beyond the one that we live in. So I think there is maybe some practical elements to it where like our way of speaking and having discourse relies on these notions in some sense.
Yeah, like you're saying it's hard to imagine a sense of truth that doesn't eventually come down to some like capital T truth. Like it can't all be lowercase truths. Like it can't all just be your truth and my truth if the word truth has any meaning.
Yeah, well, I
Because
mean,
otherwise we would just use the word. We wouldn't even need the word. We could just say what I believe, what you believe, what the anti-realist believes, or whatever. You know
I
what
was
I
gonna say
mean?
even the anti-realist has an ultimate reality. They think like evolution and the the physical parts of the brain can explain everything, right? There's an ultimate truth that everything reduces down to.
See, that's something else that was kind of I was really hoping to get your take on with Rappaport was something he said. I think he says it pretty explicitly that he wants to unite religion and science, something like that.
Yeah, I think he just doesn't want there to be this weird division where people think religion is entirely at odds with science. And I do think like he wrote this in what, the late 70s?
The preface was dated in 1997.
Okay, so yeah, I guess this is one of his last works. But I mean,
Yeah,
most of his career was in the 70s, right? I
right.
think that was even in the 90s, though, I think like this division between religion and science was more talked about, like the new atheists and all that stuff in the 90s.
Uh-huh.
So I don't know. I don't see this as much, but I do think they're still there. Like you see it with the anti-realist people, right?
Well, I've actually come across this in quite a few areas. I've come across this with Um, I come across this with a lot of new agey type stuff, but like I feel like there has to be a right way and a wrong way, or maybe a productive and an unproductive way to go about, you know, like one of the things that I see that's really has always irked me is okay, we want to bring religion and science together. But then what I see a lot of people do is they really don't actually do that. all they really do is they start talking about science using religious words, and they start talking about religion using science jargon, almost always quantum mechanics jargon for some reason. But it can also be neuroscience jargon, whatever it happens to be.
He doesn't do that. So he says religions have these four elements: the sacred, the numinous, the occult, and the divine. And that we cannot reduce religion to a utilitarian or functionalist interpretation, like a scientific interpretation, because it would become tautological. And what he means by that is like, if you describe religion in terms of its like evolutionary purpose, then all you're doing is saying like religion is this set of actions. And then you're tautological because you're not saying anything more than what you're observing. So what he's trying to
Mm.
do is get underneath like what are these four elements? What are the entailments of them? Like what comes out of them? If we believe in these things, what kind of further things are going to arise from these beliefs? So that's why he's trying to unite science with religion in the sense that like he wants to see if we analyze religion on its own terms, what things would arise using a scientific method.
So it seems like he anticipates this kind of like fake solution to the religion science gap.
Yeah,
And he has some sort of limiting principle that he's applying there, it seems like.
right.
But I guess maybe to kind of play like, devil's advocate a little bit, like if he's talking about religion as like a lie that isn't a willful deception, like is it possible that someone comes along and genuinely thinks that, oh, if I just, swap out some terms here, swap out some terms there, I'm solving a practical problem for people. I'm allowing people to have access to a new narrative or a new paradigm that helps them sort of navigate their lives, and maybe that helps them. It helps them emotionally, mentally, spiritually, whatever. Who is harmed by that, and who's to say that that's not itself a new religion?
What would he say about that?
What would anyone say about that? Because I'm deep into the relativism, man.
I
I'm
mean, I
like
think
getting pulled deeper and deeper down every day.
I think we can separate the different functions. So religion, like philosophy, has a therapeutic function and another function, right? It has like epistemic functions. It has like leisure functions, right? It's fun for some people. It can be used as a context of discovery. So I think religion is the same, right? Like religion doesn't have to be one thing. He's just trying to see what unites religions and the way they talk. And not everything's gonna fit into that. And like just the nature of language, right? So we're gonna call things religions that might not be religions in one sense, but they are in another sense. I think if we try to look for like outliers, we're gonna find them, but I don't know if that is conducive to the overall point.
Okay. Well, what's his other basic premises that you wanted to talk about?
Sure. So his main argument is that so all those components I mentioned, the sacred, the numinous, the occult, and the divine, he thinks they're united in ritual. So ritual is the structure of religion, and all of these parts are like entailments from the form. He divides that into two parts: performance and practice. I'm guessing that performance would be like the like rituals proper, like say a mass, right, or a sermon, and then practice would be like the everyday like dogmas that we follow. Oh, another interesting thing he says is that social contract morality, creation, time and eternity, immortality, and the ordering of the world, they all are entailments of ritual. So he's like making some pretty bold claims here. Like we can't
Yeah.
even have like fundamental organizations or even like just how we conceive of reality without religion in some sense.
Well, where do the ideas around which the rituals kind of converge come from, if he's also saying that they come from ritual?
What do you mean?
Like it's kind of a chicken or egg thing, I guess. Like we need rituals to come up with all these concepts.
I think he's saying that ritual is prior to those concepts.
But see, that's what I don't understand. Like how do you have a ritual like baptism before you have concepts like salvation?
I think that you have like similar to language, you'll have like proto ritual, right? Like maybe you bury the dead, but that hasn't been formalized yet. But since language and ritual are kind of arising at the same time, and so once you have language and this proto language, this proto ritual, you start assigning symbols between the two things, and then now you have a discourse of the symbols. And once you have that, you have an eternal logic, and then that's when these entailments start to arise. So I'm thinking like, okay, you might have these proto rituals and they don't involve a social contract, right? Because not everyone's buying into it. It's just things that people are doing almost biologically. But then now that they have this language, they're able to um maybe enforce it or spread it or get agreement on it, consensus on it in some way through the language, and now it's become ritual. So that's why he says it's an entailment, like it's almost like coextensive with it. It's like logically necessary that if you have the ritual, you have these other things.
Right. So we kind of already have these sort of vague, nebulous ideas maybe kicking around in our heads, and then they get kind of concretized in rituals. And then those rituals themselves become more and more refined and maybe even elaborate over time.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like life itself, right? Like you have all this proto life, like these bonds and stuff, but one day it's life. There's no exact point where it just became life, right?
Yeah. But he is going a little bit more than just saying he's not saying like evolution is just a useful narrative framework to make sense of the development of religion. He's saying, right, that like religion actually plays a part in evolution,
Oh, yeah.
which I find really interesting.
It's the evolution of humanity, right? Like he's not saying that like we're literally evolving to a new species. Like it's not like Darwinian evolution, but it's like it's a form of adaptation.
Yeah, could you go into what you said about his how he understands adaptation? Because that like really piqued my interest.
Well, he gives two definitions. So he has the process in which living systems maintain themselves in face of perturbations, right? So that's kind of like the biological definition. You encounter a change, a problem that you have to overcome, and then you adapt in order to face it. But then there's the epistemological sort of adaptation, which is the process in which adaptive systems are organized to maintain their truth in face of perturbations, which continually threaten to falsify them, right? So this one's interesting because like I don't know how easy it is to apply it to. I haven't read the literature on this. He kind of like introduced it from someone else who wrote about it. So I don't know the full extent of it. But I just found it interesting because this almost puts truth to the level of adaptation in a sense that like truth is only so good as it preserves the system that's maintaining. And he goes back to this a few times.
Yeah, I could that can be a little concerning. We're
It's
getting
interesting,
into
right?
some, yeah,
Yeah, I don't know if I'm concerned or yet or not because I like to see where he goes with it. But like,
right.
he basically says there's a big system, the overall system, which would be your religion, and then there's subsystems, right? So just because you change part of the state of the religion doesn't mean you're shifting the whole thing. And so he says like basically how religions will work is they want to preserve like their main idea, right? Like Judaism, there's one God, or in socialism, I think he compares that, right? Like you might want to preserve the fundamental equality of individuals, right? But then you might change within the subsystems, right? Like you might say, well, we need to get there through a vanguard party, or you might need to get there through like a social democracy or market socialism or something. So that wouldn't change the overall goal that the system's trying to pursue preserved, the fundamental truth, but it is changing the form in which that truth takes.
To me, it seems like he's drawing a distinction between what he considers adaptation within a belief system and cognitive dissonance, which I don't doubt actually happens. I'm not saying that it's not a real thing. I just think it's overused as an explanation.
Oh, I agree. Yeah. But I also was so on the opposite side too. I was thinking of things you've said before, right? Like where people build these systems and they say like everyone is doing their own eternal work internal world and like they're kind of separated and like their truths are all related to themselves, but then somehow you have the ultimate truth outside of that perspective, right? I was
Yeah.
wondering about that with this too, because I'm like, this is being presented as another theory of like I kind of have the inner idea of the workings of religion, and I'm somehow outside of it in some sense.
Mm.
Like, is anthropology another system of belief that is a falsification and it's no more true than any others? And then if so, like by what standard is what I'm reading useful to me if it's not my social system of understanding?
Well, right. I mean, it's certainly a falsification from the perspective of the very groups that anthropologists study, you know?
Yeah. So I don't know. That's interesting to me too, because I'm like, it's same with the anti-realist stuff that we're talking to too. It's like, okay, everything's false and everything's your belief, but then like, why do you have access to a truth beyond your belief? Like, how can you say the moral realist doesn't believe in these things literally and that they understand them, that they're intelligible to them, and that those things are true for them, right? Like, I just don't, it's a weird, like, I don't know. I feel like this kind of paratrope argument is still hard to overcome.
What's that? The paratrope argument?
It's when you invert the argument on itself. So Socrates did it on Protagoras' view that like man is the measure of all things. Well, he says if man is the measure of all things and I'm a man and I think your theory is false, then you have to accept that your theory is false from my perspective.
Oh, okay. That was
Yeah.
kind of self-refuting in a way.
Yeah, and I don't know if it's like directly self-refuting, but it's like why do you have any more claim to be beyond the kind of stance of your culture than anyone else?
Exactly.
I guess we're at a few more minutes, but so maybe I'll go into this other concept in the intro that's kind of interesting, which is the great inversion.
Hmm.
So he says that basically this language evolution constitutes what he calls the great inversion, which is like for most evolution adaptations, the species follows the adaptation. But in this case, it's inverted where the species has control over the adaptive apparatus. So now they can take the apparatus and change it to basically bend it to their will, right? And that's the beauty of language is that it puts the species in front of the adaptation. So they don't blindly follow beliefs and customs, but they actively change and create them.
Yeah, I believe that. I feel like religion is like a constantly evolving thing. Like it's something that is constructed and refined and like expanded over time. Like I've talked about this with Dave Ellis that he said that religion never comes into being fully formed, basically, you know? And I think that's true.
Yeah, it has to be created over time. Um, the limits of it and stuff become more defined. And because it's adapting to social situations, there's always going to be like changes, like early on in Christianity, there's this proliferation of ideas as what it means to be Christian. And then over time, it coalesces through social reproductive methods like councils and stuff.
I think just that approach of approaching changes in religious expression in terms of adaptation is in itself just seems such a it just seems so potent in the way of offering a more charitable way of interpreting changes that occur in religion
Hmm.
than what I tend to see.
Right.
I think that's what excites me about it.
So yeah, maybe we can just end it real quick with connecting it to what we've been talking about too, though. Like, do you see any implications to how we were reading Schopenhauer or
Hegesias.
yes, yes, yeah.
Yeah, I think with Schopenhauer, I think I talked about how like today he tends to get lumped in with the existentialists of the 20th century, and
Hmm.
he kind of gets roped into this discourse around life's meaning. And it's
Hmm.
literally like ever since I've had we had that conversation last week, I know my phone is listening to me because now I'm getting all these recommendations about Schopenhauer and how his philosophy helps you live a meaningful life. And it's just like, again, I still don't know where I stand on that. As far as like, it's not historically accurate, but seems to help people. So that's a whole other thing. But I think I think that's kind of an example of what we're talking about, how we, like reading something anachronistically into the past, like the discourse around like life's meaning, reading that into philosophers who kind of predated that discourse. Um, that might be an example of where we're trying to go backwards evolutionarily.
Hmm.
We're going against nature. We're becoming perverts, historical perverts.
Yeah, fetishists, as Marx would say.
Yeah.
Well,
Meaning
I'm wondering too,
fetishists.
though, even within it, though. So, like, Schopenhauer's trying to look for this ultimate truth, and then what he falls back on is ultimately religion. And I think the Cyrenaics, they're different than the Epicureans, but all those Greek philosophers are very much in the cult, right? Like they still have their leader, they still have their schools, like there's a system in a world that they're trying to building. And I think it's really important to remember that like we are as when you're doing philosophy, you're maybe on a quest for ultimate truth, but maybe think about the contingent truth and where it falls and what your own preconceptions are, and maybe maybe there's nothing more than the constructed truth, and that's why you come out with the logic that you do.
Yeah, and maybe that's not so bad. Maybe it's not such a bad deal.
I don't know if, and like we said at the beginning, I don't know if you have to give up the universal, but just be more aware. I mean, there's it's hard. It's a hard thing to to wrap your head around.
Yeah.
And I know like in my own conception, I want to find some kind of ultimate truth, but I am aware that like, hey, that might just be a tendency that I can't help.
See, I think I used to definitely be like looking for some ultimate truth and some single framework to make sense of things. And I think what kind of changed that was I've I I've been through so many different frameworks and I tend to go pretty deep. I tend to get pretty hardcore and insane every time I get into something. So I've kind of run that program through so many times, and yet I've taken something from all those experiences, all those different religions and philosophies I've gone into. I still take something, but the thing I tend to leave behind is the idea that this is it. This is the great explainer. I tend to leave that behind and take whatever is left that still works. And I think I've kind of just come to a point where I just sort of look at it like that's just the way it goes. And maybe that's not such a bad thing.
Yeah, but maybe you also have tricked yourself into thinking you've got the perspective that's beyond the others.
Yeah, it's possible. I mean, by next week, I'll probably be a full-on anti-realist if everything keeps going the way it's been going. So then we'll have other problems to deal with.
Oh God. All right. Well, let's end there.